Nate the lawyer, I disagree. Systemic racism is alive and well within North America, particularly within the United States of America. Well, I know that there are quite a few people who are following Nate the lawyer and have really made their opinions at this point as it relates to the Breakfast Club interview that took place, really pitting the left-wing perspectives versus the right-wing perspectives when they brought Larry Elder onto the show. Nevertheless, watch this video all the way to the end to see exactly why systemic racism, systemic discrimination, oppression, all of those things are absolutely real. It's true, and it's actually quite dangerous to say otherwise. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Lavinia Latham, and I'm a Canadian human rights lawyer. I've spent my entire life fighting anti-Black racism. First as a student back in undergrad, and then of course during law school as the national president of the Black Law Students Association of Canada. After I became a lawyer, I continued to fight anti-Black racism through social justice reform, as well as through test case litigation, policy review, presentations to inform the general public, and now, of course, this YouTube channel, Lavinia Latham JD. I've also had the rare opportunity to fight bad law right here in Canada at various different courts and tribunals, but most notably at the Supreme Court of Canada, which is essentially the equivalent here in Canada of SCOTUS within the United States of America. So I share all that to say, I think I've got a little bit to say, a little bit of extra expertise as it relates to anti-Black racism and discrimination and human rights law. Feel free to go ahead and check out my website, lavinialatham.com, for even more information about all of the work that I've done within this space of anti-Black racism and human rights law. So before we hop right into this debate, we're gonna need to, really come to terms with a working definition of what systemic racism even is. What better place to go other than the United Nations website itself? According to the UN Human Rights Chief Michelle Bachelet, systemic racial discrimination extends beyond any expression of individual hatred. It results from bias in multiple systems and institutions of public policy, which separately and together perpetuate and reinforce barriers to equality. So let us run with that working definition for the rest of this video. So as you can see, systemic racism is something that has quite a few layers to it, right? It's not just a surface level social phenomenon that only exists in certain places and certain areas. So let us address the elephant in the room. This particular debate that took place on the Breakfast Club with Larry Elder and a woman whose name I cannot remember at this time. If you're watching this video, let me know in the comment section down below. But during the video, there was quite a bit of back and forth. There was a lot of repetition as it related to the woman's particular point. Now, I will concede and say that the way in which the lady presented her argument was a bit unstructured, and perhaps, she could have given a little bit more opportunity for Larry Elder to really make his point. However, I do believe that what the woman was saying was actually accurate, and I do believe that you will feel that way too by the time you get to the end of this video. So when we start talking about Black leaders who occupy positions of authority, who have quite a bit of control, when we talk about those Black leaders, and there was quite a bit of name dropping going on in the video that Nate the lawyer deconstructed. Namely, there was conversation about Barack Obama, there was conversation about prominent Black mayors, prominent Black attorneys. There was quite a bit of name dropping going on. In the name dropping, the idea was that because these individuals occupy these places of power, and they are indeed in power, that there is no way that anti-Black racism, that systemic racism could continue to proliferate, be perpetuated against Black bodies. And that absolutely is a fallacy. The reason why it's a fallacy is because anti-Black racism was rooted in slavery, which took place for over 400 years. We are now on the opposite end of that, of course. Black people are no longer enslaved within the United States of America. However, we continue to this day to deal with the after effects, the consequences of that particular era of grave injustice to the human race. So to say that systemic racism no longer exists because we're no longer in an era where there's Jim Crow laws, because Black people are no longer enslaved, because Black people can ride the bus and go to school, it's unreasonable. It doesn't make sense. If systemic racism no longer existed in North America, in the US of A to be exact, we would no longer be seeing really grave disparities between those who are white and those who are Black. I'm talking specifically about socioeconomic realities. I'm talking about the fact that if you are a person with a Black body in America, it can be determined, it can be predicted with accuracy that you will, in fact, have a more likelihood of engaging with the criminal justice system in a negative way. You will, with more likelihood, be denied something as simple as a place to live in a very nice neighborhood simply because of the color of your skin. You will most likely achieve a lesser salary because of the color of your skin. So to say that these things are no longer operating, or perhaps they're no longer a reality because we've had a Black president, and I say we in terms of the world as a whole, because of course the USA is the predominant country, and the politics within the USA, of course, they impact the rest of the world. To say that having a Black leader means that those things no longer exist, I think is a little bit idealistic in thinking. A pretty dominant argument in that video was that Black people are in charge of systems, and that's the exact precise language that was used. Now, yes, there are Black people in the US of A that are in charge of systems, and it would be quite unreasonable to say that those systems are not being run by Black people when you can see with your own two eyes that they in fact are being run by Black people. Nevertheless, let's not get caught up in what's surface level here. What's surface level here is that a Black body is occupying a place of leadership. If you dig a little bit deeper, you can see that the leadership positions that they occupy, those titles, are attached to a system that was never created with Black people in mind, that continues to work against the Black body, and that there really isn't any true form of equality being achieved with those systems. For example, we still live very close to a time where a police officer decided to take the life of a Black man just because he felt he could. And the whole world watched in shock as the life of George Floyd was taken from him, and also watched in shock as this officer was actually held accountable. The fact that we're still in a world that looks at the USA's justice system and is shocked that justice was served because the individual, the victim, was Black, tells me a very different story other than the one that's being posited here. And the one that's being posited here, of course, is that systemic racism no longer exists. If an officer can put his knee rather, on the back of a Black man's neck and truly feel that he can do so with impunity and get away with it with absolutely no charges, no legal ramifications at all, to me that says that there's still a little bit more work to be done. I was very surprised that justice was served because systemic racism still exists. Now, I'm not saying that systemic racism can never go away. I'm not going to be that negative. I think that there's still an opportunity for change. But in order for that opportunity for change to see itself realized, we really do need to have a society that's headed by anti-racist leaders, that's supported by anti-racist leaders, and not just looking for Black bodies to occupy positions of power. It absolutely is a reality, it's a possibility that one can occupy a Black body and not necessarily be an anti-racist leader, not necessarily be the individual who's pushing for equality, pushing for justice for people who do identify as Black. In other words, unless all of America, so all the leaders and all the systems that they lead, were suddenly anti-racist in nature with anti-racist policies, anti-racist procedures, and anti-racist implementation of those policies and procedures, unless all of that were true, it's not practicable to say that anti-Black racism, systemic racism, no longer exists. It's also not practicable and it's not reasonable to expect one leader to be able to unwind and undo all of the hundreds, the centuries of racism, oppression, and discrimination with their one position of power. That is so unreasonable. Another major segment of society, American society, that still experiences some systemic racism is the criminal justice system. Within America, it is still perfectly legal for federal inmates to lose their right to vote as a result of being incarcerated. Now, that law that allows the government to do those things was created at a time that coincides with the dissolution, or the abolition rather, of slavery. Now, that was put in place to ensure that there was still a mechanism to affect the outcomes of slavery, even though slavery had been abolished. And so to this day, in 2023, Being incarcerated for a felony still removes an individual's ability to vote. Guess who makes up the greater population of federal inmates? Black people, Black men particularly. And so if an individual loses their right to vote, they effectively lose their voice. Therefore, the individuals who are eventually elected into positions of power will never reflect their views, will never reflect their perspectives, because they've essentially been cut completely out of the conversation. That looks a little bit like systemic racism to me. Let's move away from the criminal justice system and talk about the school to prison pipeline. The school to prison pipeline is absolutely another area where systemic racism is alive and kicking within America. Currently, a Black student is several times more likely than a white student to experience being either suspended or expelled from their right to their education. And this is something that we see. This is a social phenomenon that is alive, kicking, and well within 2023. Additionally, a Black student is 3.49 times more likely than white students to actually be arrested at school. Now, the reason why they call it the school to prison pipeline is because if one has difficulties in school through suspensions and expulsions, having negative interactions with their educational system, there is a likelihood, there is a propensity for that negative relationship with that first institution in that child's life to then transfer over to the criminal justice system, making it more likely that that student who experienced suspensions and expulsions in their educational journey to now be in conflict with the law. That to me looks like systemic racism, particularly if the individuals are most likely to be racialized, even more likely to be Black. Another example is environmental racism. When you look at those areas that are predominantly occupied by Black people, and you look at those areas in America that are predominantly occupied by white people, what do you notice? The white areas are very clean, they're well-resourced, they've got fantastic schools, fantastic hospitals. Everything is all wonderful, beautiful, and beautiful like a perfect sunny day. Now you look to predominantly Black neighborhood, and now you start to see, some of the more secure tenets of society falling apart. So maybe the hospitals are understaffed and overwhelmed. Maybe the school systems are not necessarily the best. Maybe there are a bunch of dumping poisonous and harmful chemicals directly in that neighborhood. And of course, that neighborhood is occupied and predominantly habitated by Black people. A particular example of that is Cancer Alley in New Orleans. There's actually an entire stretch along the Mississippi River that has been known to actually have a greater incidence of cancer. And guess what? Who's occupying that area? Black folk. To me, that looks like systemic racism. And why does it look like systemic racism? Why does it look like systemic discrimination? Because all of the systems in society, all of the various different organizations of power are working together hand in hand to allow the dumping of toxic chemicals into a neighborhood that is predominantly habitated by Black folk. Why is this the case? Why not choose an area of the environment where no one lives? Or if that's something that is happening within neighborhoods, why is that happening only within Black neighborhoods? These are the questions we have to ask ourselves when we start to talk about the fact or the mistaken fact that, systemic racism does not exist. If you're liking this video so far, go ahead and give it a like. Also, go ahead and subscribe right there so that you never ever miss another video. This channel is really about socio-legal commentary. It is not legal advice. If you are in need of legal advice, please go ahead and seek out a lawyer who can really respond to your individual needs and really apply the jurisdiction that you're currently in to the matters that you are currently dealing with. One thing that I do have to say I agree with, as per Nate the lawyer, is this thing right here. In his video, he states, "We live in 2023, and it is a fantastic time to be alive, especially in comparison to the past, for Black people, to us LGBTQIA+ people, etc." I would have to agree. I absolutely agree that, of all the times to be part of, quote unquote, the historically marginalized class, now would be a pretty good time to live. Would I want to occupy a Black body during slavery? Obviously not, right? So, from that lens, from that perspective, I absolutely would agree that we are closer to equality. We are closer to dismantling systemic racism, systemic discrimination, oppression, marginalization, all the things we know to be true after watching this video. But there's still work to be done. So while I do really appreciate the hopeful, positive, forward-thinking nature of Nate the lawyer's perspective as it relates to the Breakfast Club interview, I have to respectfully disagree. We're gonna have to agree to disagree on this one. Thank you so much for watching this video, good people. If you're interested in knowing exactly how I became a lawyer, a human rights lawyer at that, or how you can become a human rights lawyer, because we always need more of us, go ahead and watch this video next. It's gonna be either here or maybe even here. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.